Hello there. This lecture is the first in Unit 3, and it is about public opinion and political socialization. In other words, why do we care what we think, and how do we come to think that way? This is your first flipped assignment. This is a picture taken at a anti-Bush rally in the 2000s, early 2000s. How is public opinion a weapon of mass democracy? Thoughts? So, public opinion, the definition of it is that it's the distribution of individual attitudes about a particular issue, candidate, or political institution. So, why do we care about public opinion, and who should care about public opinion? These are things that we talked about a bit in class today, especially with the who should care part, and whether or not politicians should follow it all the time. Gallup is the original polling company, and now there are lots of others. Probably the most famous recent one is projections and polling done by Nate Silver, who he's kind of a math whiz. He has a blog called 538, and he's been pretty good at predicting elections, congressional and otherwise, for the past few years. But he's really new. Gallup is the oldest and the most trusted and relatively accurate, especially considering its age. In order to have a good poll, your representative sample has to be a good sample. It has to fall between the sample size of 1,000 to 1,500 people. People in the representative sample have to be chosen randomly from various demographics. So, like, for example, if you want to do a national poll and you know that 13% of the population are African American, you want to try to reflect that in your sample. If you know that 51% are liberal leaning, you want to represent that in your sample. So again, you want to focus on who your target is, if it's nationwide or state, and then what the demographics percentage-wise are of that. And then your sampling error needs to be at or around 3%. Anything higher than that is generally considered unreliable because it just has too much variance. You also want to poll people who have some knowledge of the polling topic. Pollsters, when they create questions, should be aware that respondents may pretend to be more knowledgeable than they actually are. Therefore, a good poll should have "I don't know" or "I haven't thought about it" or equally vague responses, so that people that maybe don't know about it feel like they have the option to say that instead of answering as though they know what's going on. You also have to focus on how you word your question. You shouldn't be push polling if you have a legitimate poll. So your questions shouldn't be leading. This is something that polls sometimes really struggle with, how to word a question, because sometimes it's accidentally misleading. So a good example of this would be, how much do you dislike Bashar al-Assad? Well, probably most people dislike Bashar al-Assad, so it seems like that might be an okay to word it, but it's pushing the person answering the poll in a particular way, instead of just saying, do you approve of Bashar al-Assad, and then giving them a scale from disapproval to approval. So questions should be yes or no, or ranking based. Do you approve of the president's job? Yes or no? How would you describe Congress's effectiveness? Excellent to very poor. And are polls always correct? This is something we talked about in class today. Not really. This is a very famous example from 1948. Truman was projected to lose the election, and a lot of newspapers printed headlines declaring Dewey the winner, even though Truman won 49.5% of the popular vote and 303 electoral votes. This is your second flipped question. It's just a practice multiple choice. Feel free to paraphrase the question and the answer. This is the distribution of the population's beliefs about politics and policies. You have A through E. All right, so do polls report on public opinion or do polls shape it? Well, there are some contributing factors, the most important of which I would say would be media. You really want to pay attention to what media source the poll is coming from, because media has become more biased over time, especially the advent of the internet. People can pick and choose the news that they see based on their political values. Other contributing factors include family and gender. The majority of young people obviously identify with their parents' political party. In 2007, there was a Harvard study, and it showed that 91% of high school seniors in 2007 identified with their parents' political views, compared with 60% later in life. By the way, this is my high school graduating class, so it was a good study. It was a good year. And then there is gender. In the 1920s and the 1930s, women were typically more likely to be Republican, because the Republican Party was seen as the party of the family and of social values. But that changed in the 1960s with the women's rights movement, and now we see the gender gap in politics, with women overwhelmingly being more likely to be more liberal than men and to vote based on very different ideologies than men. They tend to focus more on social welfare and programs for children in schools, overwhelmingly more so than men. And then we've also seen a rise in female candidates and female office holders. We've had 2 women in the running for the largest of elections, the presidential election, in the past 3 election cycles, which has never happened before. I guess there was Geraldine Ferraro, who technically ran in the 80s, but she didn't get very far. So we're seeing more and more women entering politics and entering high-level politics, which it seems like is only going to encourage more and more women to join politics and continue this trend. We also know that religion has an effect on voting trends. Christians tend to vote Republican increasingly more frequently because of their conservative, usually social-based ideology. And there's been a huge increase in a particular type of Christian, the evangelical Christians, that are especially common in the Midwest and in the South, increasingly voting more and more Republican. Not just voting Republican, but forcing the Republican Party to envelop more and more conservative Christian ideology. So it's a good example of a time when a voting bloc has really tried hard to shift what their party stands for after giving them a lot of support. Education. The higher your education level, the more likely you are to vote more liberally. In 2008, 65% of voters with postgraduate degrees, so like a master's degree or higher, voted for President Obama. And we've seen that number increase in the last election. One of the biggest designators for a Trump voter was level of education. People with a 4-year degree or higher were significantly more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton. And then there's race and ethnicity. Minorities are more likely to vote for Democrats. There's the Solid South, which was solidly Democratic until the 1950s, and then in the 1970s and really the 80s under Nixon and Reagan, the Republican Party was able to take the South. And so now the Solid South really refers to Republicans. And then age, of course. Young voters under the age of 30 are much more likely to vote Democratic than their older counterparts. In 2008, 66% of young people voted for Obama. Right, here's your third flipped assignment, another multiple choice question. What do we call the process in which an individual develops political opinions through family, friends, and other groups? All right, and then this is our last flipped assignment, and I believe also the last slide. It is. So this is a, oh, I meant to change this so it said ABC instead of dots. Oh well, you'll figure it out. All I want you to do is outline an answer for this FRQ. You don't have to write it, just outline it. So just a real quick, part A, define political socialization. Identify 2 factors that shape political socialization. We went through them in this PowerPoint. And then how does each of those factors that you identified in the second part, in part B, shape the political socialization experience of U.S. citizens? So you're defining, identifying 2 factors, and then explaining those factors. All right, so you don't need to write it, just plan it. We'll write it in class at some point during this unit. I will see you all tomorrow. Have a good night.